Hey everyone. Iced tea. Nothing better. In this video, I'm going to talk about the nature of empathy and uh, try to bring some light on the subject. I've been thinking a lot about this, and uh, it can be difficult to articulate what I want to be able to say. Empathy is when you can put yourself in another person's place and understand with a compassionate heart what they are suffering or what they have suffered. Okay? But for the most part, people don't do it. And empathy, for the most part, is an individualized emotion. Maybe not situational, but definitely individualized more often than not. There is mass empathy. You can find mass empathy probably more easily than you would find individualized empathy. And it's because of what really frightens us. So I'm going to get into that. People just rarely understand the nature of empathy. It's just that simple. Have you ever noticed? You have noticed, I can guarantee you have noticed this, that people tend to be more cruel when you're in the midst of your suffering. It feels like the whole world has lined up to kick you while you're down. And the reason that is because people are terrified of the possibility of loss without some accompanying triumph to go with it. People find it impossible to identify with someone who has suffered loss with no triumph, because the thought of putting themselves in the place of powerlessness and hopelessness and helplessness is absolutely terrifying to them. It's actually more terrifying than what you would find in a horror movie, because it's not rooted in fiction, it's rooted in reality, and it's grounded there. I mean, we all suffer loss in life. It's just part of the human experience, okay? But one of the worst parts about suffering that loss is having no one compassionate there to walk with you through that, okay? And so, why do people kick you when you're down? It's like, why do they do that? It's because, what you're doing is confronting them with the terrifying possibility of a reality that they could end up in a similar situation without any hope, without any triumph, And so they defer empathy to an afterthought. They wait until you have your triumph, and then they'll empathize with you. And so people will say to you, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Come on, man, get up, Or, why are you, wallowing in this? You got to move on, Just cut it loose, And it's not so easy for some people, And so they'll come along with righteous indignation and judge you and condemn you and call you every name in the book, because they don't want your reality to be their reality. To empathize with you, they would have to put themselves in your shoes, in your place, and see your loss, okay, from your perspective. And the idea of suffering a loss without any triumph over that loss, okay, is so terrifying to people, which as terrifying as it is, it's reality. There are people who suffer loss who have no triumph over it. Okay? It's just a permanent loss. And these things are very hard for human beings to be able to manage and deal with on a personal level. And so they'll turn to friends, family, neighbors, community, whoever, okay? And rarely find the empathy that they're looking for, and they have this eye-opening experience where it's like, wow, this world is cruel, really cruel. But in reality, what's going on is that people are terrified of your situation to such a degree that it terrifies them to consider the idea that they could suffer loss without any regaining of that loss, without any triumph over that, without overcoming the odds, so to speak. And so, you get to this place where it's like, man, what if you can't get up? What if there's no triumph to be won? And that's a reality. That's real human existence right there, because that can happen. Okay. In this regard, people think that they're empathetic, but only as an afterthought. This is the cart before the horse. Okay. So let's say you suffer loss. Yeah, I suffered loss, man. I lost this, I lost that, I lost my job, I lost my house, I lost my car, I lost every damn thing, I lost my damn mind. Okay? But you know what? I overcame the odds, man. I'm getting it all back. I got a job now. I just got a car. It may not be the best car in the world, but I got a car, and I'm getting to and from work, man. I'm fighting every day. Good, man. Good for you, man. I'm glad, man. I'm so sorry for your loss, man. God, I really empathize with you. That's not empathy. Don't be fooled. That's not empathy. That's a person who is terrified of you not being able to pick yourself back up, that they could end up homeless, that they could end up with some loss that they can't manage. Okay? That is terrifying to them. But that's not empathy. Empathy has become this afterthought. People think that they're being empathetic, but they're not. Okay? And it's only displayed after a triumph is gained. Empathy has become an emotion reserved only for those who overcome the odds and triumph. I mean, think about it. If Jesus died on a cross, and look at how many people have died on crosses, nailed to crosses, okay? But they didn't rise from the grave. So it's kind of hard to empathize with those people now, isn't it? But hey, Jesus rose from the grave. He has a triumph to go with his loss, right? So we empathize with his suffering. We would not be able to empathize with the suffering of Jesus Christ if he did not rise from the grave. Do you see what I'm saying? You can't empathize unless there's a triumph to go with it. And this is individualized empathy I'm talking about. Okay? So when you're trying to find empathy in a world and all you've suffered is loss and there is no triumph, what then? Where can empathy be found? Right? Well, it's easy for people to, like I said, empathize with that because, even if I suffer a similar loss, I have hope. My faith is in Jesus, so if I die, I still go to heaven. I live on. I live forever. I join into his life, And so we empathize because we have, it has not destroyed our hope, right? But there are people in the world who suffer loss with no triumph. And their hope has turned to hopelessness and helplessness and powerlessness. That is a reality. That's real life reality. Okay? So, I want to talk about this story I read a long time ago by Herman Melville. It's called Bartleby. It was written in 1853, right after Moby Dick. And in this story, which is kind of like it's quite comical in some parts. This guy named Bartleby gets a job as a scrivener at law firm on Wall Street. And basically, a scrivener is nothing more than a legal copyist. They didn't have copier machines back then, so they would make a legal document, proof it, and then someone would handwrite a copy of it. And then another one would be made, and another one, and another one. And then they would proof all the copies that were necessary for whatever particular legal document they had to do. And they would make these legal copies, okay? So basically, scriveners are just human copier machines, okay? And Bartleby was hired into this firm. And at first, he did a really, good job. And then he started, protesting in a very passive way. He would just say, I prefer not to. Whenever he was asked to do something, he started saying, I prefer not to. And he looked very depressed and everything. And, before I go any further, I used to work at this company. And we had this copier machine that was constantly breaking down. I mean, it was ridiculous. The guys were in there, the Xerox guys were there all the time trying to fix this damn thing. And and I told the bosses, I don't know how many times, it's like, we need to replace the copier machine. Please get a new copier machine. And you go in there after they said they fixed it and the damn thing's broke again. After making like 2 or 3 copies. It was just ridiculous. So I just started leaving notes on the copier machine that said, Bartleby would prefer not to. No one knew what the hell I was talking about. So it tells you, the education level of the people I was working with at the time. But anyway, this guy Bartleby was like a copier machine that was just broke. Okay? And he kept saying, I'd prefer not to. I'd prefer not to. Well, his boss, just the way he would say it, his boss wouldn't even reprimand him for it. And he just kind of kept going on and on and on with this. Until finally, the story ends up culminating in an event where the boss uproots his entire firm and moves to another location and asks Bartleby if he's going to come. And he's like, I'd prefer not to. And it's like, man, what the hell? And Bartleby ends up getting arrested. And he's thrown in jail. They call it the Tombs. In the story, and he's seen by by his boss. Bartleby's boss sees him walking around there, but he ends up dying of starvation in that jail because he'd prefer not to eat anymore. And it never tells you in the story why Bartleby was behaving that way or what happened to him, what truth was revealed to him that made him lose all motivation in life. Okay, even compassion for himself. Okay, but what happens is, if there is a triumph to this story, is that the boss of Bartleby, I forget his name, was moved with such compassion and empathy towards Bartleby that he cries out at the end of the story, "Ah, the humanity! Ah, the humanity!" Thinking about Bartleby. And, in my own theory, I would think that Bartleby had a much higher position in life, and somehow he suffered a loss where he couldn't do that position anymore, and he was relegated to a scrivener's job, and it was, less fulfilling, I suppose, had less purpose, and so he preferred not to do these things, and it was somewhat beneath him or something, but he just lost all his motivation in life. And we hear the boss cry out, "Ah, the humanity." And it's a story of empathy, because he's not thinking of empathy as an afterthought. He's finally seeing this man who has lost all of his motivation, everything in him, and he becomes compassionate toward him. He's motivated by compassion, without judgment, without condemnation, or anything of the sort. And he's, finally moved towards empathy for Bartleby. Okay, and that's what the story's really about, is empathy. Okay? That's individualized empathy. And that's the way empathy should be. Okay? Now, There was an event that took place in 1937 where the Hindenburg crashed. It was a hydrogen-based dirigible, and it sparked and it went up in flames in less than 10 seconds. You can see the video on YouTube. But there was um, uh, a reporter on the scene at the time, and his name was Herbert Morrison. And while he was on the scene, he saw this taking place, unfolding right before his eyes, this incredible loss of life that was gone in less than 10 seconds, where this big dirigible crashed. And he cries out in the news report, "Ah, the humanity! Ah, the humanity!" You know? And it's very famous. But he was quoting Melville. And he was saying, "Oh my God, oh my God." His heart was moved with compassion and empathy towards these people who were suffering a loss without any hope of a triumph at the end of it, because it was a mass loss of life. And he was moving the whole country who heard his report with compassion and empathy towards the people who perished. The same was true on 9/11. Although people weren't crying out, "Ah, the humanity," they were in fact crying out in a similar way, especially when it came to the 9/11 jumpers who were, being chased out by the flames and the heat, jumping to their deaths. People were looking up and saying, "Oh my God, someone just jumped. Ah, the humanity." They were saying, "Ah, the humanity," but they weren't saying it with those words, but it was the same empathy, compassion that was outpouring, because they were losing their life with no triumph after it was all over with. And so we tend to easily relate our empathy to that. But what of people who can't get back up? Huh? What about when there's no triumph to be won? What then? How do we cultivate a heart that's able to say, "Ah, the humanity," and be moved with compassion and empathy, okay, towards that person who has not suffered a loss of life, but they have suffered some kind of loss. And there has been a huge loss of motivation in the humanity found here in the United States. That's a fact. Empathy, in its purest and truest form, becomes the motivation behind compassion. And this is what most people tend to get wrong. And they treat empathy as though it's some kind of, afterthought or something along those lines, but it's not real empathy. That's not real empathy. That's just a person terrified of facing what, could happen to them if they were in a similar situation. It's an emotion only reserved for those who overcome the odds and triumph, or those who suffer loss and they don't breathe anymore as a result. Okay? And so people can easily empathize with that, because they say to themselves, your story is so inspirational that even if I suffer loss at the same degree, I know that I'll be able to overcome the odds, because you were inspired to overcome the odds, and I have the inspiration to do so as well. So now I can empathize with you. That's the cart before the horse. That's not real empathy. That's not. Herman Melville was pointing this out to everyone, okay, in an ingenious way, okay? But empathy, like I said, in its purest form, is really the motivation of, behind compassion. And it's if it's not, then it's really just righteous indignation. It's the compassionate heart without judgment or condemnation, not a heart of righteous indignation, like most people treat it. And they really do treat it that way. If you want to experience real empathy, the way Melville pointed it out. Okay, read that book, number one. Or it's only a short story. It's only about 20 some pages long. Anyone can read it. And I would highly recommend reading the book rather than looking for the movie. There is a movie, but read the book. Just read the book. Okay? You'll get a lot more out of it. But like I said, if you want to experience real empathy, you have to first give up your self-given right to judge and condemn others. And in order to do that, you have to face your own fear of loss without triumph. And there's no other way to cultivate that truest form of empathy. Then you'll be able to truly say from a compassionate heart, ah, the humanity. The humanity. And empathy has been in decline when it comes to humanity for a very long time. If you want to triumph in life, cultivate empathy and let that be your triumph. Let it be the motivation that backs up compassion and helps you walk alongside another human being when they're suffering loss without a single triumph. Let your friendship, let your love be that triumph for them. Let the cultivation of empathy within you be a triumph. So that we can look at our fellow man and say, ah, the humanity. All right? Have a nice day. I'm going to finish drinking my tea right here. I've been overdoing it with these things, man. Can't stop buying them. But I'm going out to dinner. I'm having barbecue chicken. I'm going over to my family's house. And I will see you in the next video. Take care.